Well, here we are again for a thrilling lecture, this time on alterations in temperature regulation. For those of you who have had me for physiology, a large portion of this lecture will be review for you. But for many of my students, it might have been a long time since you've had physiology, and a refresher on thermoregulation is warranted. Or you might not have learned about thermoregulation. In my opinion, thermoregulation is one of the easier concepts to master, mostly because we all have had experiences of being too cold or too hot, and we all know how our bodies reacted to those changes. But let's figure out why our body responded in those ways at a cellular and molecular level. The ability to regulate internal body temperature has provided higher organisms independence from the environment. Because the rates of most physical and chemical reactions depend on temperature, most physiological functions are sensitive to temperature changes. Thus, the activity levels of Poikilotherms, these are species that do not regulate internal body temperature, generally depend on environmental temperature, whereas those of Homeotherms, species that do regulate internal body temperature, are relatively stable over a broad range of ambient conditions. A lizard, for example, is capable of relatively less movement away from its lair on a cold, overcast day than on a hot, sunny day, whereas a prairie dog may be equally mobile on either day. So we are homeotherms, and that means we are able to maintain a stable internal body temperature despite fluctuations in the ambient temperature, or the temperature around us. But that doesn't mean that we are held tightly to our set point of 98.7 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees centigrade. Our body temperature does fluctuate a bit throughout the day. Our body temperatures are lowest in the early morning hours and highest in the afternoon. Of course, if your physical activity increases, as shown here with the girls playing soccer, your body temperature will increase due to the skeletal muscle contraction. If you are female, your menstrual cycle also causes changes in your body temperature, and a lot of women use a spike in their temperature to indicate or detect ovulation. Your body temperature also changes with age. The young and the elderly have difficulty in maintaining a stable internal temperature. Newborns in particular act more like Poikilotherms, and they look like them too, in my opinion, because their hypothalamus is not as well developed. They don't instigate a shivering mechanism when they get too cold. They also don't instigate a good sweating response when too hot. And due to their greater surface area to mass ratio, they are more prone to heat loss. So let's talk about ways we generate heat. Most of the heat we generate is through metabolic processes. The body's metabolism encompasses all the chemical processes involved in energy production, energy release, and growth. These processes can be anabolic, that means formation of substances, that is, going from monomers to polymers, or catabolic, that means breakdown. In that case, we are going from polymers to monomers. Ultimately, all energy contained in ingested nutrients manifests as heat, work done on the environment, or growth. A healthy young man requires about 30 kilocalories per kilogram of body weight to sustain resting metabolism for 1 day. Thus, a 70-kilogram human requires about 2,100 kilocalories per day, an amount known as the resting metabolic rate, or RMR. The number of calories rises with increased activity, illness, or other stress. For example, the metabolic rate can rise 2 to 3-fold with exposure to a cold environment or during the performance of heavy exercise. Humans obtain their energy from food in 3 forms: 1. Carbohydrates, 2. Proteins, and 3. Lipids. If you need to review how we metabolize these nutrients, please see Blackboard and find the Metabolic Pathways lecture. I am going to briefly discuss how much energy we get from burning each of these substances, and you should realize some of this energy is released in the form of heat. Each of the macromolecules have their own building blocks. carbohydrates are formed from monosaccharides like glucose, fructose, and galactose. For proteins, it's amino acids. And for lipids, we think fatty acids linked to a glycerol backbone. Carbohydrates exist in the body mainly in the form of glucose, and they contain 4.1 kilocalories per gram of energy. The major storage form is glycogen, a polymer of glucose. In contrast to the other potential stored forms of energy like lipid and protein, the liver can quickly break down glycogen by glycogenolysis to provide glucose for the brain to prevent hypoglycemia. Muscle can quickly break down stored intramuscular glycogen to glucose 6-phosphate or G6P to provide the energy necessary to run a high-intensity anaerobic sprint. Proteins contain 4.3 kilocalories per gram, which is approximately the same as carbohydrates. A typical 70-kilogram human with 14% protein, or 9.8 kilograms of protein, only about half of which is available as a fuel source, can thus store about 21,000 kilocalories. This available protein could potentially provide 10 days' worth of energy. Unlike carbohydrate, protein is not a primary energy reserve in humans. Instead, proteins serve other important structural and functional roles. Structural proteins make up skin, collagen, ligaments, and tendons. Functional proteins include enzymes that catalyze reactions, muscle filaments such as myosin and actin, and various hormones. The body constantly breaks down proteins to amino acids and builds amino acids into proteins, thereby allowing cells to change their protein makeup as demands change. Thus, it is not surprising that protein catabolism makes only a small contribution, much less than 5%, to normal resting energy requirements. In contrast, during starvation, when carbohydrate reserves are exhausted, protein catabolism can contribute as much as 15% of the energy necessary to sustain the resting metabolic requirements by acting as major substrates for gluconeogenesis. Lipids. Lipids are the most concentrated form of energy storage because they represent, on average, 9.4 kilocalories per gram. Lipids are dietary substances that we typically get in the form of triglycerides, or TGs. TGs consist of a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acids attached. The gastrointestinal tract breaks down ingested triglycerides into free fatty acids and monoglycerides. Fatty acids are composed of long carbon chains, 14 to 24, with a carboxyl terminus, and they can be either saturated with hydrogen atoms or unsaturated. That is, double bonds may connect one or more pairs of carbon atoms. In the metabolism lecture I posted on Blackboard, I show you pictures of these molecules and explain how fatty acids are metabolized through beta oxidation. Fats are more readily stored as fuel in the body, and this is crucial during famine. Therefore, although humans have 2 large reserves of potential energy, protein and fat, fat serves as the major expendable fuel source. Most of the body's fat reserves exist in the subcutaneous adipose tissue layers. What should you take away from this slide? Our major reserves of fuel source are our fats and proteins, but proteins are mainly used as structural support. Proteins aren't a good source of fuel until starvation is at play. So, the body will use up carbohydrates first and then switch to fat metabolism. Fatty acids represent a significant fuel source as more potential energy is stored in the bonds of fatty acids. A typical 70-kilogram human with 20% fat, about 14 kilograms, could theoretically sustain the body's entire resting metabolic requirement for nearly 9 weeks. So again, We generate heat through the breaking of the bonds of our macromolecules and their monomers. The potential energy released can be used to do work, kinetic energy, or be used to recreate high energy bonds such as seen in ATP. This is not a 100% efficient process, however, so some of the stored energy is released as heat. Thyroid hormone, part of the hypothalamus anterior pituitary thyroid gland axis, causes less efficient burning of our fuel and leads to more heat production in the body. And the sodium potassium ATPase also liberates heat. It is thermogenic and also contributes to our body temperature. As I mentioned on the previous slide, our metabolic processes are not 100% efficient. The picture on your screen is from a medical physiology text by Boron and Bullpep. You see in green the intake of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. That's energy input. And then the energy in the bonds of those macromolecules will be hydrolyzed, and this releases potential energy. This reflects energy output. The energy output can be used for mechanical work, like muscle contraction. The energy could be used to fuel other reactions that require energy, also known as endogenous reactions. The energy could be used for membrane transport, like in the case of movement of ions. Or the energy could be used for signal conduction, like conduction of electrical signals. Or the energy could be used for detoxifying reactions that might deal with urea formation or oxidative reduction reactions. But the great majority of energy will be lost as heat. Looking at the screen, you should see that glycolysis produces more heat than ATP, and the Krebs cycle gives off more ATP and less heat. But still, at least 1/3 of the energy is lost through heat. The equation you see on the screen, E equals G plus TS, is an equation to demonstrate energy balance. Your total internal energy is represented by the letter E. Some of this energy can be stored in bonds, and some of the energy can be wasted as heat. The S, time, and T represents the energy from your body given off as heat, energy in a unit of time. I am going to use an example of glucose to apply this equation. Consider, for example, if you took 1 mole of glucose and put it in a bomb calorimeter with oxygen, and you then completely burn the glucose to carbon dioxide and water. This combustion would yield about 686 kilocalories in the form of heat, but would conserve no usable form of energy. Now, consider burning the same mole of glucose in your body. In contrast to the bomb calorimeter, your body would not only oxidize glucose to carbon dioxide and water, but your mitochondria would also capture some of the released energy to form a bond between ADP and inorganic phosphate to form ATP. ATP is our body's form of cellular energy. In other words, the enzymes in our cells, when they burn fuel, are able to trap the energy and recreate high-energy bonds in ATP. In other reactions, the ATP can be hydrolyzed to release the stored energy to do various types of work. Similarly to the bomb calorimeter, some of the energy released when burning glucose is released in the form of heat, as our mitochondria are not 100% efficient. So now that we have talked about how our body generates heat through metabolic processes, we should also address how we lose that heat. Most of the heat we lose is through radiative heat loss, about 60%. And that means loss of heat through electromagnetic waves, mostly in the infrared spectrum. All objects have radiative heat loss. It is basically your body's attempt to heat up the bookcase across the room. Another way we lose heat is through convective heat loss, which uses currents of air, water, even our blood. Convection carries heat between the body and the environment. For example, as the heat released from the surface of our body heats the immediate layer of air around our skin, that warmer air will rise and a new, cooler layer of air will replace it and act as a sink source of heat. This is natural convection and is different from forced convection when a windy day moves air across the surface of our body and leads to more heat loss, also referred to as the wind chill factor. Conduction is heat transfer when two objects or substances are in direct contact with each other. Normally, this type of heat loss is minimal to us. For example, we can certainly recognize the loss of heat when we sit down on a toilet seat on a very cold day if we were camping in Yosemite. But what if you sat on that toilet seat after someone else had been there for 15 minutes? It would feel warm because it has absorbed heat from the previous person through conduction. What about if you were a victim on the Titanic and suddenly submerged in water? Now your radiative heat loss would be at a minimum, and you would primarily lose heat through the physical contact of your body with water. In other words, you would lose most of your heat in this example through conductive heat loss. Water has a very high specific heat, which means it can absorb a lot of heat before just 1 gram of water rises 1 degree in temperature. Sorry to say, you would not be capable of heating up the Atlantic Ocean a significant amount before you died. Evaporative heat loss means the water on the surface of your skin is transitioning from a liquid phase to a vapor phase. Water, in addition to having a high specific heat, also has a high heat of vaporization. When water evaporates, the surface of the liquid remaining behind, cools down as the molecules with the greatest energy, the, quote, hottest ones, leave. It's as if the 10 fastest runners on the track team left school, lowering the average speed of the remaining team. Evaporation is dependent on water vapor pressure gradient between skin and our environment. How does this apply to us? Have you heard of a heat index? It means that the true temperature of our environment might be 90 degrees, but if there is high humidity, we will experience less evaporation, and therefore our body doesn't lose as much heat, and therefore our environment now feels warmer than it really is. So when we talk about thermoregulation, or maintaining a constant body temperature, negative feedback mechanisms are used. Now before I move on, I want to be clear that heat and temperature are not the same thing. Heat is a form of energy. Temperature is not. Temperature is a way to measure heat intensity. So we have just learned about the ways our body generates heat. And if we add heat to an object, even our own body, it will have molecules that will move with greater speed and therefore have a higher temperature. We do not want our body to have a constant rise of temperature. Rather, we want to have a balance between the ways we generate heat and lose heat, and therefore maintain a constant temperature. The negative feedback mechanism for thermoregulation is really a reflex arc, and there are 5 components to a reflex arc. 1, there must be a sensor, something that monitors the body's temperature. 2, afferent nerves that send action potentials to the brain to relay this information. 3, integration. This would be the posterior hypothalamus, which will process all of the incoming signals. 4, efferent nerves that carry action potentials away from the brain to parts of the body which will respond to these commands. And 5, effectors of the body, parts of the body that will change their physiology in response to commands from the brain. The sensors for temperature are found in your skin as well as in your anterior hypothalamus. Now both sets of sensors will respond to changes in temperature, but the peripheral sensors respond mostly to changes in cold temperatures, whereas the anterior hypothalamus will respond to rising temperatures the most. The peripheral ones protect you the most from hypothermia, and the anterior hypothalamus sensors protect you the most from hyperthermia. Action potentials from these thermoreceptors are carried by nerves to the posterior hypothalamus. Here, the posterior hypothalamus will compare the set point to the actual body temperature and determine the error signal. From this error signal, the hypothalamus will then elicit heat-producing or heat-conserving reactions. The output commands are carried out through nerves, efferent nerves, to the appropriate effectors, for example, sweat glands or skeletal muscle. What effectors are used to increase body temperature versus decrease body temperature? Let's start with ways we can reduce heat loss, which will lead to an increase in body temperature. Our skeletal muscle can have minute contractions or shivering, and this generates heat. Our blood vessels in our dermis can vasoconstrict, and this will reduce convective heat loss from our body as blood is shunted to the inner core. We even will reduce the amount of surface area of our body in contact with the air. This will reduce conductive heat loss by assuming a curled fetal position. Ways we increase heat loss and thus lead to lower body temperature would be through vasodilation of the blood vessels in our skin to increase the convective heat loss. And, a side note, changing the vasoconstrictive and vasodilated status of our dermal blood vessels is an excellent way to trap or release heat and should not be dismissed as a trivial way to alter heat gain or loss. Sweat glands releasing more watery secretions to allow for evaporative heat loss is another way to lose heat, and increasing the surface area of your body in contact with the air will favor conductive heat loss. Next, the avoidance of heat-producing mechanisms, for example shivering, is employed. In fact, when we are too hot, we don't feel like moving at all, do we? We just want to be sprawled on the couch with a fan on us. From this slide, you should be able to reason that large fluctuations of body temperature are not compatible with life. Our set point for temperature is about 36 to 38 degrees centigrade. Increasing body temperature can cause organ failure and death, largely due to denatured proteins in the cells, and decreases in body temperature results in the hypothalamus losing the ability to regulate temperature, and this will lead to cardiac fibrillation and eventual heart standstill. The most common cause of hyperthermia, but not the only, is through prolonged exposure to heat and high humidity in the environment. The upper limit of air temperature that one can stand depends to a great extent on whether the air is dry or wet. If the air is dry and sufficient convection air currents are flowing to promote rapid evaporation from the body, a person can withstand several hours of air temperature at 130 Fahrenheit. Conversely, if the air is 100% humidified, or if the body is in water, the body temperature begins to rise whenever the environmental temperature rises above about 94 degrees Fahrenheit. When the body temperature rises beyond a critical temperature into the range of about 105 to 108 degrees Fahrenheit, the person is likely to develop heat stroke. The symptoms include dizziness, abdominal distress, sometimes accompanied by vomiting, sometimes delirium, and eventually loss of consciousness if the body temperature is not soon decreased. These symptoms are often exacerbated by a degree of circulatory shock brought on by excessive loss of fluid and electrolytes in the sweat. The hyperpyrexia itself is also exceedingly damaging to the body tissues, especially the brain, and is responsible for many of the effects. In fact, even a few minutes of very high body temperature can sometimes be fatal. For this reason, many authorities recommend immediate treatment of heat stroke by placing the person in a cold water bath. Because this often induces uncontrollable shivering with a considerable increase in the rate of heat production, others have suggested that sponge or spray cooling of the skin is likely to be more effective for rapidly decreasing the body core temperature. When it comes to hypothermia, the most common cause is prolonged immersion in cold water. Unless treated immediately, a person exposed to ice water for 20 to 30 minutes ordinarily dies because of heart standstill or heart fibrillation. By that time, the internal body temperature will have fallen to about 77 degrees Fahrenheit. If warmed rapidly by the application of external heat, the person's life can often be saved. Once the body temperature has fallen below about 85 degrees Fahrenheit, the ability of the hypothalamus to regulate temperature is lost. It is greatly impaired even when the body temperature falls below about 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Part of the reason for this diminished temperature regulation is that the rate of chemical heat production in each cell is depressed almost twofold for each 10 degrees Fahrenheit decrease in body temperature. Also, sleepiness develops later, followed by coma, which depresses the activity of the central nervous system heat control mechanisms, and this prevents shivering. Let's talk about exercise-induced hyperthermia and how it is similar and different to fever. First, as you exercise, your skeletal muscle contraction reflects an increase in metabolism. We have learned already in this lecture that our cells lose energy in the form of heat. So with more heat comes a higher core body temperature. The bottom graph shows our body temperature starting to rise. This seems logical so far, but notice that the graph has a plateau, which means your body temperature is eventually held constant during your workout. In other words, our body temperature rises as we exercise, but to a certain value, and then we don't see further increases in body temperature. Why is this? Well, unlike fever-induced hyperthermia, exercise hyperthermia does not alter hypothalamic set point. This means your set point remains at 37 degrees centigrade. As you exercise and your core temperature rises, eventually the hypothalamus will detect a large enough error signal that it will initiate cooling mechanisms, for example, sweating. So in the top graph, we see that there is a delay between the onset of exercise to when the evaporative heat loss is instigated. Once the cooling mechanisms are employed, the body's temperature should not continue to rise as you exercise. Fever is an abnormal elevation of body temperature. Fever can be caused by abnormalities in the brain itself or by toxic substances that affect the temperature regulating centers. Some causes of fevers include brain tumors, bacterial infections, and environmental conditions that may terminate in heat stroke. Many proteins, breakdown products of proteins, and certain other substances, especially lipopolysaccharide toxins released from the bacterial cell membranes, can cause the set point of the hypothalamic thermostat to rise. Substances that cause this effect are called pyrogens. The result of such a change in set point is that a normal core temperature is detected as an error signal by the hypothalamus as too low relative to the new set point. The hypothalamus then activates heat-generating mechanisms when the body is too cold. The temperature control system institutes the following procedures. Skin vasoconstriction throughout the body, which we already addressed. This is caused by stimulation of the posterior hypothalamic sympathetic centers. Piloerection also occurs. Piloerection means hairs standing on end. Sympathetic stimulation causes the erector pili muscles attached to the hair follicles to contract, which brings the hairs to an upright stance. This is not important in human beings, but in lower animals, upright projection of the hairs allows them to entrap a thick layer of insulator air next to the skin, so transfer of heat to the surroundings is greatly depressed. There is also an increase in thermogenesis, or heat production. Heat production by the metabolic systems is increased by promoting shivering, sympathetic excitation of heat production, and thyroxine secretion. Thyroxine is thyroid hormone. During maximum shivering, body heat production can rise to 4 to 5 times normal. At the cellular level, the mechanism of pyrogen action is increased production of interleukin-1 or IL-1 in phagocytic cells. IL-1 then acts on the hypothalamus to increase local production of prostaglandins, which increases the set point. Prostaglandins are made from the phospholipids in the hypothalamic cell membrane. A lipase cleaves the fatty acid tail, which is arachidonic acid in this case, and then an enzyme called cyclooxygenase will cleave the fatty acid into a prostaglandin. For thermoregulation, this would be PGE2. I will show a picture of this on an upcoming slide. Experiments in animals have shown that some pyrogens, when injected into the hypothalamus, can act directly and immediately on the hypothalamic temperature regulating center to increase its set point. Other pyrogens function indirectly and may require several hours of latency before causing their effects. This is true of many of the bacterial pyrogens, especially the endotoxins from gram-negative bacteria. When bacteria or breakdown products of bacteria are present in the tissues or in the blood, they are phagocytized by the blood leukocytes or tissue macrophages and or by large granular killer T lymphocytes. All these cells digest the bacterial products and then release cytokines. These are a diverse group of peptide signaling molecules involved in the innate and adaptive immune responses. One of the most important of these cytokines in causing fever is interleukin-1, IL-1, also called leukocyte pyrogen or endogenous pyrogen. Interleukin-1 is released from macrophages into the body fluids and, on reaching the hypothalamus, almost immediately activates the processes to produce fever, sometimes increasing the body temperature a noticeable amount in only 8 to 10 minutes. As little as 1/10 of a gram of endotoxin lipopolysaccharide from bacteria, acting in concert with the blood leukocytes, tissue macrophages, and killer lymphocytes, can cause fever. The amount of interleukin-1 that is formed in response to lipopolysaccharide to cause fever is only a few nanograms. Prostaglandins and related compounds, collectively referred to as prostanoids or eicosanoids, such as prostacyclin or PGI2, leukotrienes, and thromboxanes, all of these are produced by many different cells in the body. Although their primary physiological actions are generally related to inflammation and hemostasis, by nature they are all vasoactive and can modulate cardiovascular function, particularly vascular tone. Their effects are very localized because they are paracrine hormones. That means they are released by one cell and act on nearby cells. Prostanoids are fatty acid compounds derived from membrane phospholipids, as I mentioned before. When these phospholipids are acted upon by phospholipase, arachidonic acid is formed. One important pathway for arachidonic acid metabolism is the cyclooxygenase pathway, shown in this picture with the word cyclooxygenase circled in red. The COX pathway forms intermediate compounds called cycloendoperoxides like PGG2 and PGH2. Enzymes, many of which are tissue-specific, can then convert the cycloendoperoxides into the final biologically active prostanoid. There are different forms of COX enzymes, two of which are COX-1 and COX-2. Aspirin and other non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs, such as ibuprofen, and also acetaminophen, Tylenol, are non-specific inhibitors of the COX enzymes. Acetaminophen, by the way, is not an NSAID. The pathway that I'm referring to was first shown by Sir John Vane and his colleagues in the 1970s. In particular, the anti-inflammatory potencies of the different NSAIDs were proportional to their actions as a cyclooxygenase inhibitor. It was also shown that cyclooxygenase inhibition produced toxic side effects. That is, the NSAIDs caused erosive gastritis from the effects of reducing PGE2 in the gastric mucosa. In the stomach lining, PGE2 is protective. Thereby, inhibiting the COX enzyme means loss of PGE2. In fact, two kinds of COX enzymes are known now to exist, as I said. The COX-1 is related to the toxicity, and COX-2 related to inflammation. Specific COX-2 inhibition is therefore desirable, and drugs are now commercially available. On the next slide, I will talk more about aspirin and NSAIDs and their ability to block COX-1 when taken for a fever. Several experiments have suggested that interleukin-1 causes fever by first inducing the formation of one of the prostaglandins, mainly prostaglandin E2, or a similar substance, which acts in the hypothalamus to elicit the fever reaction. That is what I meant by toxicity on the previous slide. And, as we saw in the previous slide, PGE2 is formed when cyclooxygenase COX cleaves arachidonic acid. When prostaglandin formation is blocked by drugs, the fever is either completely abrogated or at least reduced. In fact, this may be the explanation for the manner in which aspirin reduces fever, because aspirin impedes the formation of prostaglandins from arachidonic acid. Aspirin, even Tylenol, NSAIDs, all of those are COX inhibitors, specifically COX-1, and they are examples of antipyretics. Advantages to having a low-grade fever are speculated to be that increased metabolism and vasodilation would mean more blood flow and more immune cells to fight the infection. Plus, the immune cells are more energized or active because of the higher temperature and can clear the infection faster. But also, there is an in vitro observation that there is increased T-cell proliferation during a slightly elevated temperature. When the set point of the hypothalamic temperature control center is suddenly changed from the normal level to higher than normal, as a result of tissue destruction, pyrogenic substances, or dehydration, the body temperature usually takes several hours to reach the new temperature set point. The figure above demonstrates the effect of suddenly increasing the temperature set point to a level of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. Because the blood temperature is now less than the set point of the hypothalamic temperature controller, the usual responses that cause elevation of body temperature occur. During this period, the person experiences chills and feels extremely cold, even though his or her body temperature may already be above normal. Also, the skin becomes cold because of vasoconstriction and the person begins to shiver. Chills can continue until the body temperature reaches the hypothalamic set point of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. Then the person no longer experiences chills, but instead feels neither cold nor hot. As long as the factor that is causing the higher set point of the hypothalamic temperature controller is present, the body temperature is regulated more or less in the normal manner, but at the high temperature set point level. Crisis, or flush, if the factor that is causing the high temperature is removed, the set point of the hypothalamic temperature controller will be reduced to a lower value, perhaps even back to the normal level as shown in the above graph. That's what crisis or flush means. In this instance, the body temperature is still 103 degrees Fahrenheit, but the hypothalamus is attempting to regulate the temperature to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. This situation is analogous to excessive heating of the anterior hypothalamic preoptic area, which causes intense sweating and the sudden development of hot skin because of vasodilation everywhere. This sudden change of events in a febrile state is known as the crisis, like I said, or more appropriately, the flush. In the days before the advent of antibiotics, the crisis was always anxiously awaited because once this occurred, the doctor assumed that the patient's temperature would soon begin falling. Malignant hyperthermia, or MH, is a potentially fatal, inherited disorder usually associated with the administration of certain general anesthetics and/or the drug succinylcholine. The disorder is due to an acceleration of metabolism in skeletal muscle. The signs of MH include muscle rigidity, rapid heart rate, high body temperature, muscle breakdown, and increased acid content. Immediate treatment with the drug dantrolene usually reverses the signs of MH. The underlying defect is abnormally increased levels of cell calcium in the skeletal muscle. The skeletal muscles go into a hypermetabolic state and consume large amounts of ATP and burn through glucose stores. The muscle then must use alternative fuel sources and can even go into an anaerobic state where now more acids, such as lactic acid, are produced, and this leads to pH problems, metabolic acidosis. During an episode, a person's body temperature can rise at a rate of 1 degree centigrade every 5 minutes and can rise as high as 109.4 degrees Fahrenheit. There is mounting evidence that some patients will also develop MH with exercise and/or on exposure to heat environments. That means they will have an episode if they have the genetic mutation. In other words, other things can provoke this episode in these patients. Without proper and prompt treatment with dantrolene sodium, mortality is extremely high. Dantrolene is used to help relax certain muscles in your body. It relieves the spasms, cramping, and tightness of muscles caused by certain medical problems, such as malignant hyperthermia, but is also used for other purposes, like with multiple sclerosis, cerebral palsy, stroke, or even injury to the spine. Dantrolene does not cure these problems, but it may allow other treatments, such as physical therapy, to be more helpful in improving the patient's condition. Dantrolene acts directly on the muscles to produce its relaxant effects. Specifically, it blocks the ryanodine receptor on the sarcoplasmic reticulum membrane. That's the organelle in skeletal muscle that stores calcium. And it blocks the ability for calcium to be released, and a skeletal muscle cannot contract without calcium release. Malignant hyperthermia is an inherited autosomal, and it's inherited in an autosomal dominant fashion, which means only one person need have the condition to pass it on to the next generation. Unexplained fevers that continue for more than 3 weeks are referred to as a fever of undetermined origin. FUO is classically identified by the following elements: a temperature higher than 101 on several occasions, a fever that lasts longer than 3 weeks, failure to find the underlying cause or causes of the fever despite 1 week of inpatient investigation or 3 outpatient visits. FUOs are caused by infections 30 to 40% of the time, neoplasms 20 to 30% of the time, collagen vascular diseases the other 10 to 20% of the time, and numerous miscellaneous diseases that can include drug involvement, cirrhosis of the liver, etc. The literature I've looked at reveals that, as previously mentioned, between 5 and 15% of FUO cases defy diagnosis despite exhaustive studies. Factitious fever is uncommonly considered of major importance in the differential diagnosis of fever of undetermined origin, although it is a readily identifiable syndrome and one that can be easily excluded if it has been considered. My research on this has been really interesting. Early identification may reduce the necessity for prolonged, expensive, and potentially hazardous hospitalizations for such patients. A retrospective study in 1978 identified 2.2%, or 11 out of 506 patients, whose fever on their charts was coded as fever of undetermined origin, as having actually factitious fever. These patients either created factitious fever by manipulation of their thermometer or through fraudulent fever by self-induced means. A review of the literature yielded an additional 70 cases in which fever was either the sole factitious sign or part of a larger, more complex factitious illness. And here's the fun part. The patients who did this were typically young, female, and often associated with the medical profession itself. I have already talked about hypothermia, but I would like to revisit just a little bit more. Hypothermia is defined as a core temperature less than 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Accidental hypothermia can develop in otherwise healthy persons in the course of accidental exposure. That means being submersed in icy waters, as we've already discussed. Alcoholism, cardiovascular disease, malnutrition, and hypothyroidism contribute to the risk of hypothermia. Hypothermia is also a common occurrence in the operative patient and in newborn infants. Signs and symptoms of hypothermia include poor coordination, stumbling, slurred speech, irrationality, poor judgment, amnesia, blueness, puffiness of the skin, decreased respiratory rate, lowered oxygen consumption, sleepiness, and coma. Hypothermia also causes cardiac dysrhythmias and can be detected on an EKG with the classic camel hump presentation as the repolarization moves from endocardium to the epicardium. It actually should be from epicardium to endocardium. It is easy to decrease the temperature of a person by first administering a strong sedative to depress the reactivity of the hypothalamic temperature controller, and then cooling the person with ice or cooling blankets until the temperature falls. The temperature can then be maintained below 90 degrees Fahrenheit for several days to a week or more by continual sprinkling of cool water or alcohol on the body. Such artificial cooling has been used during heart surgery so that the heart can be stopped artificially for many minutes at a time. Cooling to this extent does not cause tissue damage, but it does slow the heart and greatly depresses cell metabolism, so the body's cells can survive 30 minutes to more than 1 hour without blood flow during the surgical procedure. That concludes our discussion on alterations in temperature regulation. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. We have another one for this week, alterations in nutritional status, and that is a very large lecture. So I hope you enjoyed that one as well, but it's a lot of work to do this week.